The views and opinions of the Jonathan Kinloch Show are not those of WADL Detroit.
Everybody has an opinion about what's going on in Detroit, but few individuals have a clear understanding of how Detroit works. My guest here today is Charles Beckham. Charles Beckham has been with the city of Detroit in various positions and capacities for over 4 decades. We're going to have a conversation with Charles Beckham on the other side of the break, and it's going to be very interesting, very informative, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jonathan Kinloch Show. Few individuals have had the opportunity to see how Detroit really works. My next guest, Charles Beckham, has served in a number of different positions within city government since the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s. He served in 5 mayoral administrations. He worked in 8 mayoral campaigns. He's held 11 executive municipal positions for 4 mayors. The various positions he served truly has taught this gentleman how Detroit works. He's also served and advocated on behalf of African American business owners as the co-founder and executive director of African American Association of Businesses and Contractors. I am happy to have here in the studio as my guest, Charles Beckham.
Hi, Jonathan. How are you this morning?
Doing quite well.
Good.
But I can't say that, at least for the city of Detroit, because Detroit is, as you are quite aware, has been through some very challenging times. But Detroit has always gone through challenging times. During the Mayor Young administration, we had the threat of receivership. But even with that threat, the city of Detroit never actually received a receivership. A receiver was never appointed over the city of Detroit. What happened between the Young administration and the various administrations that the city of Detroit had to experience to where we are right now?
Well, I think part of the problem, and you're right, Jonathan, I mean, it's an understatement to say that we're in some financial trouble right now within the city of Detroit. We've experienced a number of years of spending more money than we had coming in, expenses exceeding our revenues. The big difference between now and then was that we had a better tax base, we had better revenue sharing from the state, we had better support from the federal government, and so it was a little easier to make the hard decisions in terms of allocating revenues to make sure the city keeps going. But you're absolutely right. In the late 70s and early 80s, the city was facing some tough financial times, as were a number of other cities. I think everybody can recall Cleveland and New York, some of which, in fact, did go into receivership. We were able to not get into that situation under Coleman Young. He made the hard decisions. If people recall, he went to the people, said, we've got some troubled times ahead. We're spending more money than we're having in. I need to raise taxes. And so Detroiters taxed themselves at that time to pull ourselves out of that. The problem is that we continue to have decreasing property values, decreasing revenue sharing from the state, decrease in property tax revenues. And so our revenues continue to drop exceedingly fast, population decline, that puts us now in the spot where our decisions were not fast enough to stay up with the decline. So we're in a much tougher situation now, and it's going to take much harder decisions and some pretty tough leadership to get ourselves out of it.
Leadership. The citizens of Detroit back in 2009 was desperately looking for leadership. You had a number of individuals who said that they would answer that call, and we had a special election to fill the unexpired term that was created because of the early resignation by former Mayor Kilpatrick. During that election, you had Dave Bing, who was his candidate at that time, saying that he would appoint a turnaround team to put together a crisis management plan. After he was elected, he did appoint that crisis management team. A plan was presented to both the public as well as to the various news media outlets. What happened with that plan? Because from what I understand, and from what I understand, actually from what I know, you had a very big part of executing that plan as well as developing that plan.
No question about that. As you know, we did 4 elections in 15 months. It was a very unique and trying time for the city of Detroit. I was Dave Bing's campaign manager, matter of fact, and a part of a very small team.
So we blame you for this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I take my share of the responsibility of doing that, but I don't make any excuses for that. It was, I think, the right decision now, and I still think it was, but let me explain that. Those were some very unique and troubled times for the city of Detroit. The mayor's office, unfortunately, under the Kilpatrick administration, had begun to develop this cloud of corruption and all of the things that were going on, dishonesty, etc. We needed to restore integrity to that office. At that time, and I still think it was a good decision, we thought Dave Bing was the only one that could really do that. And I believe he's done that.
Can I say that a city of 700,000 people, 700,000 people.
Absolutely.
Dave Bing, at the time that he ran for the city office of mayor, did not live in the city of Detroit. Why did we have to go outside the city? There's a number of ethical individuals who live in the city of Detroit, who love this city, and who would have had a better understanding of how the city works than Dave Bing. So why was this thought of going outside the city, bringing him in with no government experience, especially with even establishing a stop sign inside of the city of Detroit?
Yeah, and I hear that, and we hear that argument, and we thought about that. And of course, the mayor did move in within the parameters of the law to be a resident. Again, we thought that Dave Bing was that best candidate. We put around him a very strong team of individuals and experts to address the problems that were there. We developed the concept of a crisis turnaround team, and the crisis was financial. We put that team together and put them in place. We had some very significant people in metropolitan Detroit that were put together to address that problem. Freeman Hendricks and Denise Illage and others were co-chairs of that. They started to identify the problems. What happened is that we got overwhelmed, and the situation became overwhelming that we didn't move fast enough. The financial problems we had in the city of Detroit are time sensitive. If you don't begin to spend less than what you take in, it's going to cause you a problem. And so we had a problem where we just didn't address those problems fast enough. While you were still discussing them and reviewing them and doing reports, the situation continued to get worse.
But if I can recall, there was a lot of will in Lansing to work with Mayor Dave Bing early on. They passed legislation to allow for the city of Detroit to exceed the cap that was in place for cities as it relates to the deficit stabilization bonds. The city of Detroit issued those bonds, and we're going to talk about more of the issues that brought us here to the point of where we have a consent agreement and a lot of various different challenges in the city of Detroit financially. We'll be right back after this break. Jonathan Kinloch interviewing Charles Beckham. Here in the studio, I'm having a conversation with Charles Beckham, who has a 40 years of experience with the city of Detroit and understanding its operations. He served in a number of different roles. Right now, we are talking to him, before the break at least, we were talking about that role of actually managing the plan that was developed by the crisis management team. The city of Detroit had a relationship with Lansing, a great relationship with Lansing, to the point that the Bing administration was able to go to Lansing, get them to raise the cap on the city's ability to sell deficit stabilization bonds. The city did that. But how did the selling of those bonds tie into implementing this crisis management plan? What happened?
Well, let me say, there's two things here, Jonathan. The financial situation that the city found itself in was not something that just happened in the last 3 years. This can go all the way back 50 years, back to Jerry Kavanaugh days, when, as I mentioned to you, we had declining revenues. The population decline has started happening in Detroit in the 50s. That reduced property taxes, reduced property tax values. There was an exodus of people leaving Detroit, both black and white. And so this problem began to happen a long time ago. One of the conversations we had with Dave Bing as we were campaigning, and I remember having that with him several times, is saying, you know, Mr. Mayor, when we get there, we may not get there in time. The problems that Detroit were facing were so severe, and we hadn't addressed enough of those solutions quick enough, that it was questionable whether or not we're there. And I think that's still a question that may still be out here.
Let me ask you, you all took office in May of 2009
That's correct.
And, after the special election.
That's correct.
The city did not run out of money in June, July, August, September, October, November, and it did not, and even we've heard in recent months that the city of Detroit would be running out of money. So what I'm saying is, had the administration grabbed the bull by its horn and began to restructure the city of Detroit, as was clearly understood that it was necessary to do that upon taking office, we would not be in the point of having to have state intervention at the level that we have state intervention. All I'm saying is that what could possibly go through the individuals' minds who are sitting in these positions, knowing that there is a looming crisis if things are not dealt with? You got the $200-something million out of Lansing. What happened to it?
Well, you know, keep in mind, these are overwhelming financial issues. They're short-term and both long-term.
Absolutely.
When the mayor took office, this current mayor took office in May of '09, the structural deficit was probably about 250 million,
Right.
which is pretty severe.
Absolutely.
The long-term deficit was 15 to 20 million, a billion, depending on who you talk to. So there was a short-term deficit problem, a long-term structural deficit problem, and a cash flow problem. So for years, the city has been juggling paying vendors and payroll and bond payments, not just starting in May of '09, but long before then. So the problem is you get into office and you come in as the mayor and you come in with your team and you've got all of these issues facing you. Which one do you take on first? And in the meantime, you still have 700,000 residents that still want police service, public safety, fire, EMS, the buses running, and all of those things that you have to keep going day to day. I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to minimize the magnitude of the problems that every mayor, not just Dave Bing, but Kilpatrick before him, we started doing restructuring and layoffs under the Kilpatrick administration.
But what I'm saying is,
all the way back.
Dave Bing came into office with the will and cooperation of the legislature and the governor. You have to use that political goodwill to the advantage of the city. Mm-hmm. There should have been, from the very beginning, an understanding that the city of Detroit needed some additional revenues. Mm-hmm. There should have been some conversations of creating, whether it's a special tax or some type of legislation that would allow for addressing, one, the long-term debt that the city of Detroit found itself in, as well as the short-term structural deficit that the city of Detroit addressed immediately with the Lansing leaders as it relates to trying to get the revenues from the deficit stabilization bond to deal with the short-term cash flow issues. Mm-hmm. So they should have used that conversation to deal with the short-term cash flow issue as well as the long-term debt. A lot of folks have some issues with the Bing administration because they seem as if, because it appears as if they don't really understand the politics of the office of the mayor.
Well, and there's certainly room for that argument. Let's keep in mind when the Bing administration came in, Granholm was still the mayor. Snyder came in the next year after that. Let's also keep in mind that the state was broke and hadn't been managed appropriately. And so very little help was available to come from Lansing, in addition to the fact that both the House and the Senate were under Republican control. So we weren't going to get a lot of help from there. What we needed to do was to begin to develop plans, both from restructuring to deal with the short-term deficit, and we began to do that, to look at how we could handle the long-term debt, how we could, in fact, continue to do some deficit elimination bonds, which we did do. The problem is they weren't enough and they weren't done fast enough. There's no question about that.
You're absolutely correct. Granholm was there
Yes.
when Bing took office,
Yes.
but what I'm saying is The relationship in Lansing was still quite rosy, especially during the Granholm administration. They were able to get those deficitization bond cap increase during that time. And then you also had a pretty good relationship and great dialogue that the mayor was having with Rick Snyder. My concern is that the mayor is not having the right conversations with the leaders in Lansing, and he did not have the right conversations. And right now, I think it may be a little too late, because we're in this agreement, this consent agreement, and I really would like to know from you, is there a way out of this? Someone who understands the city of Detroit, is there a way to get from the point of this consent agreement where we can begin running the city on our own again?
Jonathan, I got to be honest with you. I think it's going to be very difficult. These are very difficult times. And as I said 3.5 years ago, I wasn't so sure that when we got there that we would get there in time. These are going to require some very, very difficult decisions that most politicians don't want to make.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion. Jonathan Kinloch, and I'm having a conversation with Charles Beckham. Welcome back to the Jonathan Kinloch Show. Mr. Beckham, before the break, we began having a conversation about the consent agreement that the city is currently under. How quickly could the city of Detroit take appropriate action to move outside of this, the need of this consent agreement?
Well, in the consent agreement, that's another discussion for another time. I'm not so sure that the consent agreement in its current form is going to be very helpful for Detroit.
Let's touch on that, because right now you have a consent agreement that has add to the debt that you were talking about. The state, who was supposed to come in and assist the city with the structural deficit as well as the long-term debt, added more to both.
Yeah, it's the consent agreement as it stands today is kind of a hybrid. It's really not an emergency manager. It's not an emergency financial manager. We literally now have a committee of 20 people attempting to make these very hard
and I don't think people really
and very
understand that.
timely decisions that need to be made. Just by the very nature, you're going to extend that time. So I'm a little opposed to the current consent agreement. But having said that, we have a short-term structural deficit, a long-term structural deficit, and a immediate cash flow problem. If you remember and go back to the GM and the Chrysler bankruptcies, and they went into bankruptcy, we're unfortunately very close to that. But one of the biggest things that happened there was an immediate infusion of cash. And that was the big argument with the legislators down in Washington. You need to have some money to address your short-term cash needs. We have to do that same thing here in Detroit.
That's the politics, that's the political conversation that the mayor
Because the only
failed.
place that's going to come from is the state of Michigan. Federal government doesn't have the money. So you have to put something together. Now, that's not just the governor. The governor doesn't have the ability to just give cash. He's got to go through the legislative process. So now we have a Republican legislature that doesn't even agree with the governor all the time.
But let me say
we've
this.
now got to try to work some deals with to get that done.
What they have
it's
to
not that
understand,
it's impossible, but you can do
They
it.
have to understand that as go Detroit, so goes the state.
No question about that.
When they went to meet with the folks on Wall Street and said they were considering putting an emergency manager in the city of Detroit, the Wall Street explained to these Michigan politicians that it will affect the state's bond and every other bond rating that's coming out of the state of Michigan as it relates to government. Why not? Why not file for bankruptcy? Because at the end of the day, no, seriously, at the end of the day, if we're talking about dealing with the long-term debt and the state is coming in here and creating a fire sale anyway, why don't we actually, if it's really about eliminating debt, have a conversation, pull together the information, at least that's what I think the council should do, to educate the people on what a bankruptcy, what Detroit would look like on the other side of bankruptcy. We should have that conversation at least.
Well, but here, and I don't disagree with that, but here's why you don't want to do bankruptcy. For municipalities, it's Chapter 9. You have 7 and 11 for individuals and companies. First of all, there's very few people that understand Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Probably only 3 or 4 lawyers in the country to understand that. There's 4 or 5 cities in California now that have gone into it. Right. Nobody has looked very well on the other side of Chapter 9. Right. But what happens in Chapter 9 is that now you go into the United States federal court system, in the bankruptcy court system, go into bankruptcy. a judge, a federal judge, appoints a receiver. He may come from Alabama, California, Mississippi, somewhere. He will have no relationship to anything that's happening here in the city. And his only and sole goal will be to liquidate assets and to pay off as many vendors and bondholders that the city owes at the time, irrespective of what's needed for public safety, irrespective of anything. No.
Okay, well,
there's a big difference in that. You'd be much better off having an emergency manager or a consent agreement with people who are local and in charge than you would from some nondescript individual that comes in with a fire sale approach.
Well, look, this is from many individuals' perspective. That's what we're experiencing right now. These individuals who are on this financial board, I'm not sure how many of them actually reside in the city of Detroit, but right now the city of Detroit is being run from outside of the city boundaries. The governor and Andy Dillon, who do not live in the city of Detroit, are actually pushing fiscal and other policies onto the city government. Because let's say this, you're saying we don't have an emergency manager.
Right.
What are the powers, I should say? What are the powers of the project manager? The project manager can implement various different projects and various different programs if the mayor and council does not comply with the plan that has been put in place.
If they don't agree. But it specifically says in the consent agreement that the mayor and the city council are, in fact, still viable entities implementing policy in the city of Detroit. If they fail to do it, it goes through a process where those entities review it. It does not say that they run it.
That review must have been 24 hours because we saw what the imposing piece was.
But you still have a mayor and the person that we elected and a city council that is in place.
That's superficial. The mayor is touting this consent agreement as if it's a life jacket for the city of Detroit. He's hiding behind this consent agreement instead of managing the city that he said that he wanted to manage.
Certainly in a room for argument to say that. My point is that when you read the consent agreement, it specifically says that the mayor is still the mayor of the city of Detroit. Now, if this were a Public Act 4 emergency manager, mayor would be out. City council would be out, and you would have an emergency manager.
What's the difference? You have the project manager.
Because the project manager is not making those decisions.
The project manager can impose. If the elected leaders say this is something that's not in the best interest of the city of Detroit, the project manager can still impose it. And guess what? Many of these issues that they're putting on the table, they know the council, they probably won't have the votes on council, and the council necessarily don't even have to vote for it because they have cover. They can hide behind the consent agreement, hide behind the project manager. That's so unfortunate. But let me ask you this. The election of 2013 is right around the corner.
That's correct.
You put this thing on us called Dave Bing. Do you believe Dave Bing will be seeking re-election?
Well, listen, it's not from anything that he has told me. I don't think he would do that, and I say that based on the fact that I understand what it took for us to convince him to run in the first place. This was not something he sought out. We sought him. This has been a tough job. It's a damn near impossible job. I'm not so sure that anybody in their right mind would want to take this job on, Jonathan. It's going to be a very difficult task, but who knows? What I do know is that public office has a lure to it, and people begin to stay in it once they get in it. But come 2013 and first weekend in May, we'll find out who, in fact, officially says that. We've got 3 or 4 viable candidates now that have kind of thrown their oar in the water. Well, the mayor has kind of danced around it a little bit, but you're absolutely right. The next mayor is going to have not only this same challenge that we have today, but 12 more months of whatever we're going through now. Imagine that and the pressure that's going to be on them to solve the problems of the city of Detroit for the 700,000 Detroiters that we have.
Let me ask you, among the names that are being touted out there, your name is mentioned as a potential candidate. We've had a great dialogue here about the challenges of the city of Detroit. You seem to have a clearer understanding. What's your thought on seeking that office?
That is not something I'm seeking right now. As you know, I've been retired for 2 years. I've done this city government piece, as you say, for the last 4 decades. I've served 5 mayors. I've done a lot for the citizens of the city of Detroit. I love this town. I love this city. People who are throwing my name out have not done that with my approval.
Absolutely. Well, look.
And I'm not looking forward to that because, as I said, it's going to take a person that's somewhat challenged to take that on next year.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank you for coming on. This should have been our conversation because there's a lot of things that we did not cover.
Complex
and
subject.
You have a lot of information. I know of no safe repository of the ultimate power of society but the people, and if we think them not enlightened enough, the remedy is not to take power from them, but to inform them by education. That's what I hope we've been doing here each week, educating you and informing you on all of these issues that affect us around here. Until next week, have a great week.